Part B. Paul's understanding of the relation between virginity and marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Christ's statement and the teaching of the apostles. General Audience number 82 of June 23rd, 1982. Having analyzed Christ's words reported in Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 to 12, we should pass on to the Pauline interpretation of virginity and marriage. Christ's statement about continence for the kingdom of heaven is concise and fundamental. In Paul's teaching, as we will soon be convinced, we can see a correlation of the teacher's words. However, the meaning of his statement, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, as a whole, should be evaluated differently. The greatness of Paul's teaching consists in the fact that when he presents the truth proclaimed by Christ in all its authenticity and identity, he gives it his own tone, in some sense his own personal interpretation. An interpretation, however, arising above all from the experiences of his apostolic and missionary activity, and perhaps immediately from the need to answer the concrete questions of those to whom this activity was directed. In this way, we encounter in Paul the question of the reciprocal relation between marriage and celibacy or virginity as a question that troubled the minds of the first generation of the confessors of Christ, the generation of the disciples of the apostles, of the first Christian communities. This question was raised by the converts from Hellenism, that is, from paganism, more than by those from Judaism. And this may explain the fact that the topic presents itself precisely in a letter to the Corinthians, the first. The tone of the whole statement is undoubtedly magisterial. The tone, like the language, is also pastoral. Paul teaches the doctrine that the teacher handed down to the apostles, and at the same time he enters into a kind of continuous dialogue in this subject with those to whom he writes his letter. He speaks like a classical teacher of morality, facing and resolving questions of conscience, which is why moral theologians loved to turn by preference to the clarifications and deliberations of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It should be remembered, however, that the ultimate basis of these deliberations is to be sought in the life and teaching of Christ himself. The apostle underlines with great clarity that voluntary virginity or continence flows only from a counsel and not from a commandment. Quote, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give my counsel as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy." 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. As one can see from the words just quoted, the apostle distinguishes, exactly like the gospel, see Matthew chapter 19, verse 11 to 12, between counsel and commandment. On the basis of the doctrinal rule of understanding the proclaimed teaching, see TOB Audience 73, paragraph 4, and Audience 76, paragraph 5, he wants to counsel. He wishes to give his personal advice to people who turned to him. Thus, counsel in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 clearly has two different meanings. The author affirms that virginity is a counsel and not a commandment. At the same time, he gives his counsels both to married people and to those who still have to make a decision in this regard. And finally, to those who are in the state of widowhood. The problem is substantially the same as the one we meet in the whole statement of Christ reported by Matthew. See Matthew chapter 19, verses 2 to 12. First about marriage and its indissolubility, and then about voluntary continence for the kingdom of heaven. Nevertheless, the style of this problem is very distinctive. It is Paul's. Quote, "If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his virgin, if she is past her prime, and it is fitting that it happen in this way, let him do as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them even marry. But if someone stands firm in his heart, being under no necessity, but being the arbiter of his own will, and as determined in his own mind to keep him his virgin, he will do well. So then he who marries his virgin does well, and he who refrains from marrying her does better." 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 36 to 38. The one who had asked for counsel could have been a young man who found himself faced with the decision to take a wife, or perhaps a newlywed, who, faced with ascetic currents that existed in Corinth, reflected about the direction to give to his marriage. It could also have been a father or guardian of a girl who had raised the question of her marriage. In this case, the issue would have been directly the decision that derived from his rights as a guardian. Paul is, in fact, writing at a time when decisions of this sort were up to the parents or guardians rather than the young people themselves. In answering the question addressed to him in this way, he attempts to explain very precisely that the decision about continence or the life of virginity must be voluntary, and that only such continence is better than marriage. The expressions does well and does better are in this context completely unambiguous. So then, the apostle teaching that virginity or voluntary continence, the abstaining of the young woman from marriage, flows exclusively from a counsel, and that in the right circumstances it is better than marriage. The question of sin, on the other hand, does not enter in any way. Quote, "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin, and if the young one marries, she does not sin." 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 27 to 28. On the basis of these words alone, we certainly cannot form a judgment on what the apostle thought and taught about marriage. This topic will be explained in part already on the basis of the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and more fully in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 to 23. In our case, we are probably dealing with the answer to the question whether marriage is a sin. And one might even think that in such a question there is some influence of dualistic, pre-Gnostic currents that later turned into syncretism and Manichaeism. Paul answers that the question of sin does not come into play here at all. It is not a question of discernment between good and evil, but only between good and better. Later he goes on to explain why the one who chooses marriage does well, and the one who chooses virginity or voluntary continence does better. We will occupy ourselves with Paul's argument during our next reflection.